Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Assalamu alaikum. Peace be with you all. My name is Anas Altikriti. I'm the Chief Executive Officer and the founder of the Cordoba Foundation, the host and organizer of this conference today. I'd like to welcome you all and thank you for making it to the conference that will proceed under the title Islam and Democracy, Exploring the Strategies of Political Islam and the Muslim Brotherhood's Contribution. I'd like to, first of all, get a couple of thanks and acknowledgements out of the way. And first and foremost, I'd like to express deep and quite profound thanks and gratitude to the hotel that has agreed to host the conference. Not just has its services been outstanding, but also it has been quite principled and quite brave in the light of a few threats to, on certain levels, if it went and proceeded with holding this conference. So I have to mark my gratitude to the hotel and its staff, each and every one of them, for the outstanding services that we have received. I'd also like to thank the convener for today, Dr. Abdullah Faliq, my old friend and colleague, and who's put all this together alongside an outstanding team of volunteers, everyone whom you see working the aisles and organizing the sessions, carrying various issues, shifting various stuff. They have been working tirelessly in order to put this conference together, and my gratitude goes to Abdullah Faliq and every single one of his team. The conference, as I'm pretty sure most of you will agree, comes at a very, very timely and opportune moment. The discussion, not only locally or nationally, but also internationally, on the theme of political Islam, the Muslim Brotherhood specifically in the post-Arab Spring era, is one that needs to be given an injection of insights from a variety of dimensions and perspectives. And I believe and I hope that today will achieve that particular aim. The media interest is obviously there, and we've all had a look and seen various articles that have emerged over the past few weeks, months, since the military coup in Egypt in 2013, particularly focusing on the Muslim Brotherhood and political Islam and whether it's a good or bad thing, and how this ties into various events around the world, particularly those whom are labeled as terrorist events that fall under the label of terrorism, and the discussion on the ideology, the approach, the narratives, and the actors who might or might not be linked to the Muslim Brotherhood nationally or globally. I'm sure many of you have seen the article that appeared in the Sunday Telegraph this last Sunday, also accusing a plethora of civil society organizations here in the UK of being tied to the so-called global network of the Muslim Brotherhood. So it would be quite useful, I think, that today we address some of those issues and we shed light on some of the themes that will make the whole picture a lot more clearer to many of us. We are obviously here in the UK interested also in this particular theme because we have a review that the government set up almost a year ago that is yet to see the light of day. Whilst we were promised that the John Jenkins review would be published in July of last year, we have seen constant delays, and now probably that report will never see the light of day for a variety of reasons which we can only speculate on, simply because we have had no official word from Whitehall. So that also, I think, today might be addressed in a variety of manners and from different perspectives. It gives us incredible pleasure to welcome you all, delegates from all sorts of backgrounds. Amongst the crowd, we have politicians, we have people who work in the media, people who are scholars and thinkers, people who are from academic backgrounds and the like, activists from a variety of interests globally as well as domestically. And hopefully that will also add to the kind of discussion that we're hoping to have throughout the day today. I'd like to thank all those who agreed to speak in the various panels. Most of you have traveled from, let's say, nearby, from either London or just outside London. And I thank each and every one of you. But my gratitude goes particularly to our guests who have traveled from abroad and from afar, especially Professor Yasin Aktay and his team, who have traveled all the way from Turkey to be with us today, as well as Professor John Esposito, a long-standing friend of the Cordoba Foundation, and someone whom I'm pretty sure all of you have read for many, many years on this particular issue. I doubt that we have within the Muslim world someone who has written as much on political Islam or on Islam generally, more than John Esposito. So it's great to have him back here in London. This conference coincides with the 10th anniversary of the Cordoba Foundation. Yes, I can barely believe it either. It seemed like only a few months ago that myself and Abdullah Falak came together in a very small office in Victoria and started this whole idea. The Cordoba Foundation was established simply to understand and address why it was that the relationship between the West and the Muslim world went through ebbs and tides as it does. Why is it that at these times it is seen as highly problematic when there are so much strategic as well as commercial and trade interests that tie both spheres? Are the troubles because of ideological issues, faith issues? Are they because of historical grievances? Are they because of mere politique? What is it that governs the relationships between the Muslim world and the West? Is it a matter of narrative, or is it real politics in play that affect, promote, or maybe hinder those relations? And how is it that we can project for a better world for both people, for both parts of the world? That then mutated into a variety and a whole spectrum of means and methods in order to come to a better understanding of this particular area, involving activities such as these, conferences, small-scale meetings, roundtables across the world, as well as being involved in initiatives to create peace and to build new relations in newly emerging realities in various countries. We've been involved in Sri Lanka, in Malaysia, in South Africa, and across Europe on several levels. And despite the fact that throughout the 10 years, there are times when one almost thought of or contemplated giving up, the detractors, the attacks that we come under, actually have led to our resolve being stronger and more solid. The last of which I'm pretty sure that most of you heard was the designation of the Cordoba Foundation as a terrorist organization by the United Arab Emirates government. Now, some of you, as rightly I did at the time, snigger, but it's a serious accusation. And just not to scare anyone or alarm anyone, but hey, you being here today, you're almost complicit. So, but these go to justify and to add to our resolve, and that what we're doing is bearing fruit. We remain a private organization. We're not a charity, by the way. We are a privately funded organization that aims to create peace, to create a platform in which people can interact in dialogue and discussion on all levels, whether it be political, social, economic, ideological, faith. That's our aim, because if you have a culture and a safe place for open discussion and dialogue to take place, then the alternative is not going to be needed. And that's particularly what we aim to do. War and violence and conflict seldom solved anything. In fact, I would say that they almost never solve anything. It's the culture of dialogue and discussion that we at the Cordoba Foundation believe in and try to cement and promote, that creates the kind of reality that we all aspire to. I have received, and I must acknowledge the comments that I've received from some of you, saying that it's unfair the way in which we've broken up the panels, 3 panels today, because some of the panels, one would like to attend all 3, but unfortunately the limited time and space that we have, as well as all the themes that we want to touch on, the last thing we wanted was to hold a conference for the mere reason or cause to hold a conference and say that we've held a conference, but then touch on issues very superficially. We want to touch on the areas where questions are being raised, where people want to understand more and hopefully engage in a constructive discussion. We are going to touch on a variety of topics, and I urge you all to get involved as much as possible. This conference is not held under Chatham House rules, and therefore I urge you all to comment, to tweet, to Facebook, to Instagram, to do as much as you can in order to basically tell about the conference and what you think of what's being said. Now that's me for now, and I'm going to hand over to our speaker for the first keynote address. Now, I have to say that this was initially in the first schedule that some of you might still have in your hands. This was issued a few weeks ago. We had as the first speaker, Professor George Joffe from King's College, London. Unfortunately, Professor Joffe had to travel to the United States because he was asked to give a statement as a witness in a terrorism case. So he couldn't say no, and he expressed his apologies and conveyed his regrets that he couldn't be here with us. But thankfully and kindly, we asked Professor Jeffrey Haynes to step in, and he did at very, very short notice. And for that, I, on everyone's behalf, am deeply grateful. Professor Jeffrey Haynes is Associate Dean in the Faculty of Social Sciences and Humanities at London Metropolitan University. He directs the university's Centre for the Study of Religion, Conflict and Cooperation. He is the author or editor of 38 books, the most recent of which are Faith-Based Organizations at the United Nations, published by Palgrave in 2014, and Religion and Political Change in the Modern World, published by Routledge in 2014. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Professor Jeffrey Haynes.
I do have a PowerPoint. I'm hoping my colleague will magically produce it on the screen any moment. Unless I can do it, I don't know. Okay, well, just ad-libbing for a moment then. Thanks very much for the invitation. It was at short notice, so every weakness and deficit of the talk is due to the lateness of me being asked. Otherwise, it would have been absolutely superb. I've got just 15 minutes to cover a few of the issues which we're going to spend the day on. As you know, very few issues that we're concerned with today have absolute meaning that's objectively agreed with it by everybody. So this is a very speculative introduction. But as I say, just to hopefully get some points to the rest of the day's concerns. One of the key issues really is how we define some of the terms that we talk about, but tend to gloss over in terms of what precisely we mean. If we, for example, were to go around the room and ask each individual in the audience what an Islamist is, what Islamists are, what a moderate is, then we'd probably get different views and different judgments. Similarly with words like democracy. They don't have objective meaning, yet we use them as though we do. So the first point I think is to make is that methodologically, the terms we use are quite problematic, although essential in the sense that we wish to understand reality and we wish to understand a rather complex and often unclear reality. The ideas that we are talking about and the actors that we will be talking about don't necessarily agree with our designation of them. So this adds another complexity to the issues of Islam, democracy, and the way that change is being exemplified, both in the Middle East and North Africa region and in the UK in relation to Islam to some extent. So there's ambiguity, there's conflation of issues, and often overgeneralizations. But I suppose one could say that any field of endeavour is prone to such concerns, and that doesn't necessarily, or shouldn't necessarily, stop us from trying to take things forward. I think we're looking at two overlapping but distinct developments today. We're looking at the astonishing events of the last 5 years in the Middle East and North Africa. 5 years ago, 4 years ago, there seemed to be quite a lot of certainty on the part of Western-based scholars of democratization that the Middle East and North Africa was finally engaging on a process of democratization that the rest of the world, most of the rest of the world, had undergone from the mid-1970s. This notion of the third wave of democracy, which saw dozens of countries move from a state of non-democracy to varying states of democracy. The Middle East and North Africa, of course, was a region which didn't seem to be touched by those events. And then suddenly, out of the blue, for many people, the so-called Arab Spring occurred from late 2010, revolutions in Egypt and Tunisia, overthrow of Gaddafi in Libya, and the onset of the still unfinished Syrian civil war, to mention just 4 of the key events which have transpired since then. It's now very clear that the outcomes are unclear, and that to talk about an easy move towards a democratic framework and structures within the countries of the Middle East and North Africa, the 20-plus countries in that region, is simply not on the table. So we seem to have got into a phase, a stage of messy incompleteness in which states are less than stable, in which there are transnational actors of various kinds active across the region, in which political outcomes are very uncertain indeed. And the rest of the international community seems to find it very hard to know what to do. So we're in quite a different set of circumstances in relation to the Middle East and North Africa. What is also plain, of course, is the involvement of various actors, which I'm calling political Islam here. And as we will see over the course of the day, the problems with such a generalized designation is that we have a range of actors that can be categorized in that way, but a great lack of clarity about what precisely such actors seek to achieve. The focus is also on the UK. The conference is also interested in the UK. And there are, of course, explicit links between the Middle East and North Africa and the UK in relation to the topic that we're looking at today. The two particularly that I was just asked to focus on are the Counter-Terrorism and Security Bill, which is going through the UK Parliament right now, and the government's review of the Muslim Brotherhood, which we've heard already has got lost somewhere in the bowels of Whitehall and is not yet published, and as we've heard, may not yet be published. I'm not making any explicit links between the two developments, especially, other than to say that these are two issues which are taking the attention of the British government. And one could argue that both of these developments emanate from events which occurred in the Middle East and North Africa region over the last 4 or 5 years. The Counter-Terrorism and Security Bill going through Parliament is going to the House of Lords now for further amendments. It's a bill which is squarely about terrorism. It's about seeking to identify those identified as terrorists, to control their movements, to assess what they're doing, to enable British government to have more oversight into those it identifies as terrorists. It's a controversial bill, but it follows in a train of events in the West more generally, in which governments are trying very hard, it seems, to deal with what they perceive as terrorism, but finding it exceptionally difficult to actually take control of events in the way that they would like to achieve. The downside, one of the downsides, may well be that there is an increasing control of actors that the government identifies as terrorist or quasi-terrorist or would-be terrorist, and this can very easily circumscribe debates about political issues, political directions, and the way forward when it comes to political futures. So there's a great danger that this will instill and inhibit political debates in a way which is not desirable. The Muslim Brotherhood report, it's a controversial, as we've heard. It was scheduled to appear last summer. It's almost certainly not going to appear this side of the election, if at all. And it's not so much perhaps that the government hasn't come to a conclusion or hasn't identified the issues it wants to take seriously, but it's extremely sensitive on the one hand, and it also reflects a wider confusion about the role of what I'm calling political Islam after the democratic disappointments of the Arab Spring. The review was ordered by David Cameron in April 2014, so nearly a year ago, and it's often said that the UK government was bowing to pressure from some of its allies in the region, UAE, Saudi Arabia and Egypt to name but three, who in their own way are strongly hostile to this category of political actors I'm calling Islamists. And the concern is that somehow various strands of political Islam are also involved in terrorist activities. And the UK may be concerned not to upset its allies in the region, is willing to undertake such a review. But it's highly sensitive, and it's difficult for the British government to come out with a clear conclusion. The Muslim Brotherhood was, of course, the leading player in Egyptian politics until July 2013, when the army overthrew the democratically elected government of President Morsi. And the UK ambassador to Saudi Arabia, John Jenkins, was asked to look at the Egyptian regional and international role of the Muslim Brotherhood, and Charles Farr, head of security and counter-terrorism at the Home Office, was asked to look at Muslim Brotherhood involvement in Britain. Farr was to examine the philosophy, activities, impact and influence on UK national interests at home and abroad of the Muslim Brotherhood and of government policy towards the organisation. So it's a fairly comprehensive, wide-ranging, almost global focus upon an actor which had suddenly become vilified as a political problem following the overthrow of the Egyptian government in 2013. Well, as we've already heard, John Jenkins finished his report months ago. It's not appeared. The UK government is, I think, quite embarrassed at how to present its findings because nothing has been found, apparently, allegedly by Jenkins, to warrant the accusation of terrorism. Now, we know that this term terrorism is an extremely vague and open-ended and imprecise one, but nevertheless, it's still clear from my understanding that the report contains no damning evidence, no evidence at all, actually, about involvement in so-called terrorism. There's an ideological issue because the Muslim Brotherhood is close to Hamas, and Hamas is itself identified as a terrorist organisation by Britain, the EU, Israel and the USA. So there's kind of guilt by association to some extent, but that's not enough to produce a smoking gun from the British government's perspective, I think. So we're in a position now where the Muslim Brotherhood's position in the UK is highly problematic, but as yet no damning or other evidence from the UK government to enable us to say that that is in fact an accurate representation of the organisation in the UK or indeed internationally and regionally. I wanted to just talk a little bit about political Islam. It's highly difficult, and one can look at a number of scholars and see different ways of categorising various examples of political Islam in action. in the Middle East and North Africa and in Britain, there are various radical groups and various moderate groups. And these terms are bandied around in a way which is quite unclear analytically and in many ways methodologically. There are, however, it's clear to say, I think, discernibly different strands of political Islam. What I'm calling here Islamic revivalists, which are against a westernization of their political environment and perhaps against liberal democratic frameworks to do politics. And then there are, of course, what I'm calling Islamist reactionaries, the Al-Qaeda, the Islamic State, actors whose very worldview and raison d'etre is completely anti-democratic and are intent on changing the status quo at the global level. It's necessary for me to highlight the differences in approaches between the founder of the Muslim Brotherhood and contemporary Muslim Brotherhood leaders. So the Muslim Brotherhood over time has moved from one kind of political position to a more openness towards democratic ways of doing politics. And this, I think, would characterize the notion of moderation. To some extent, there is a willingness to engage in democratically oriented politics in the context of a competitive political environment to seek and achieve power. So I think I probably have my 15 minutes. I realise that I've not been very in-depth about anything, but hopefully I've just raised a few issues which will be of wider concern over the course of the day. The Muslim Brotherhood's initial anti-Western outlook has changed to make the Muslim Brotherhood much more moderate in terms of the Salafists and the Jihadists, who see the Muslim Brotherhood as too liberal, too Western, and too moderate. So a polarisation, perhaps, that doesn't seek to evade the nuances of different shades of political Islam, but certainly we can start from the premise that there is a polarisation. This means willing to take the Western-approved democratic route, including when necessary, willing to work with non-Muslims. And the Arab Spring effectively highlighted differences between, on the one hand, militant conservative forms of political Islam and moderates. So polarisation, bifurcation is an overgeneralisation, but it's a starting point for understanding events in the region and, to some extent, the emanations of political Islam here at home. And then just to finish off with some further reading, we will, of course, hear from John Esposito later on, but I can certainly recommend his book, The Future of Political Islam. Peter Mandeville, another American scholar, a recent book called Islam and Politics, which is a very good overview. And an older book, but something of a classic of the genre, Jean Vol's Islam and Democracy from the late 1990s. So I will stop there, and thank you very much for your time and your attention, and hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you very much, Jeffrey Haynes. I appreciate that very much. And it does allow for an opening up of the discussions that we're hoping to have throughout the rest of the day. I'd like to now open for our morning panel, and I'd like to invite the moderator for the panel, a very good friend and someone whom we've worked with over the years on many, many issues. And my gratitude goes to the Right Honourable Clare Short. And just a brief introduction. I'm pretty sure you all know Clare, but she was a Member of Parliament for Birmingham Ladywood from 1983 to 2010, and Secretary of State for International Development from 1997 to May 2003. In 2003, Clare resigned from the government over the Iraq War, and in 2006, she resigned the Labour whip. In November 2004, her book, An Honourable Deception, New Labour, Iraq and the Misuse of Power, was published in an attempt to explain why Tony Blair went to war in Iraq. In 2005, it was awarded Political Book of the Year by Channel 4. She stood down from Parliament in 2010 and is now active in various organisations, including Trade, Justice for the Developing World, and for a just settlement of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. She is a member of the Advisory Committee of International Lawyers for Africa. In March 2011, she was elected Chair of the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiatives, a mouthful, I have to say, EITI. I would also like to ask to come up to the main table Professor Yasin Aktay, and I will leave Clare to introduce her guests from the profiles. Also, Dr. Maha Azzam and Dr. Azzam Tamimi. So if you can all come up to the table, and I will hand over to Clare Short.
Well, good morning, everybody. It's very good to see so many people here. I think they always say we'd all sell out one day, but you certainly sold out today with all the seats taken. This session is exploring the nature and manifestation of political Islam today, and we've got a glittering panel with very, very interesting experience with a Turkish, Egyptian and Palestinian perspective, and we only have an hour. So it's going to be very difficult to do justice to the quality of our speakers, and therefore I'm going to have to enforce the 10 minutes each, if you will forgive me. But that's the only way we can keep this rich conference going. So with no more ado, I want to first turn to Professor Yasin Aktay, who's from Turkey, a distinguished academic and writer, and an activist in Turkish democracy.
Okay. First, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and all the guests, and thank you for Anas Altikriti, Mohammed Sudan, and the Cordoba Foundation, which organized that meeting, and make me really very much honored to be here among you to discuss this issue and this struggle or this strive for more open society within the Muslim world. I talk about the open society that connotates the Karl Popper's very famous book, Open Society and Its Enemies. And now I think it is the time to talk about the democracy in the Muslim world and its enemies. Who is the enemies of the democracy in the Muslim world? And the mostly possible enemy is indicated to be the political Islam or the Islamism or radical Islam in the Muslim world, but that is really very bad and very unfair propaganda, I think, from the beginning, by starting to reject or to deny that efforts for demonizing political Islam or the word political rather than Islam or Islamism. I think the perception of Islamism or political Islamism equates it with the utopian projects speaking or seeking for radical transformation of society or the world by force. The concrete model for such kind of Islamism is exemplified by Taliban or in nowadays by ISIS or the so-called jihadist movements. The equation of all these movements with political Islam is, I think, the core of the paradox, since there is nothing political in such movements, I think, in such movements which are called militant Islam or political, there is nothing political. The concept of the political, above all, requires the discussion or negotiation with the other. So the ambiguity in conceptualizing the political Islam or Islamism or radical Islam or in general the relation between Islam and politics is prominent. In this usage of the term, the genuine dimension of the political, I think, is missing, and that is the most important thing and the most important dangerous thing that's happening in our world, which are demonizing the word political. Actually, in normal condition, under normal conditions, the word political is a positive word, but when it comes with Islam, it becomes a very bad thing. When you converge the word political with the word Islam, it becomes suddenly it becomes a very dangerous thing. What is this thing that makes the word political so much dangerous? Is the problem is with the political, or is the problem is with Islam? What is the problem? What we are like, what we are liking, I mean, do we like the Islam which is always with gun, it is armed, or militant Muslims who are armed and fighting, or people, the Muslim people who are negotiating, who are talking, who are defending something with political context or political processes? I think the political, the world of the political, I think, is missing, and so the analysis fail to identify several manifestations of Islamism, since they cannot see Islamism except in its imagined forms, which has nothing to do with the actual reality of the Muslims. Indeed, the Islamist discourses of the post-colonial times had a vision of Islamic state or Islamic government, which had been produced as mirror image of socialist revolutionary utopias, and which might be considered as the base of such imagined Islamism. Some cases of this early Islamism had articulated its discourses through a claim for a revolution which would radically change the social and political system into an alternative one, having been systemized and elaborated in modern times. However, even then, this was not the only articulation of Islamism, and the actual variety of projects on the name of Islamic State could be considered as the historical manifestations of Islamism rather than Islamism as such. This kind of revolutionary Islamic movements managed to arrive at an Islamic revolution in Iran, or a long-standing resistance movement in Afghanistan against the Russia, Soviet Union, radical opposition against radical opposition movements in Egypt, Syria, Tunisia, Algeria, and so on, against occupiers or dictators of post-colonial times. The Iranian practice of an Islamic state constituted a very rich experience to think on the possibility of an ideal Islamic political model in modern times. The experience was not less valuable than the strong bureaucratic consequence of the theory in the Soviet practice in its relationship with the Marxist theory, which had required the abolishment of the state in its bureaucracy. And it is not an exaggeration to say that through a revolution, and it is not, it is that through a reflection on this experience, most Islamists had realized the modernist origins of some of their imagination of an Islamic state or of a revolution. The utopia has continuously revised again and again by new interpretation or practices of Islamic politics. Thus, the popularity of Islamic movements in general ran with some flux and reflux, but never disappeared completely. Furthermore, these movements had to change their visions and strategies, even with the idea of an Islamic state. Furthermore, these movements had to change their visions and strategies, even with some reflections on their theoretical ideas about the idea of an Islamic state, revolution, politics, democracy, etc. What remained after all this is that the manifestations of Islamic political have proliferated in time, so that it became impossible to reduce Islamism to one cliché. Of course, there should be something common in all these political actions to underline its Islamist or Islamic character. It means Islamism is an ongoing political process, requires some criteria, otherwise it will be difficult to distinguish what is really Islamism and what is not. Indeed, the lack of the criterion is that the only reason for the repeated declaration of the end of Islamism, so-called, which sometimes periodically occurs in our times, in the 20th century, even in the 21st century, which is always very soon followed by a failure of the declaration of that identification. I think because of the narrow time, I should be more brief and indicate some my points. When let's go just 3 or 4 years ago, when the Arab Spring was still a spring, and at that time when the people, I mean, the people arose against the dictators, seeking for something, for example, seeking for freedom, seeking for honor, and seeking for bread. That was the three basic elements which were prominent in these revolutions, especially. And we remember that somebody talked about the end of Islamism because of there is nothing Islamic demands within these revolutions. Yes, actually, but just to seek for we heard, and I remember now many analyses, social analysis, sociological analysis about the nature of that revolutions, which were welcoming these revolutions because there was nothing Islamist in this. Actually, the expectation or the imagination of Islamism through this analysis was very interesting because nobody suited to any imagination of Islamism that an Islamism may seek for bread. Islamism may seek for democracy. Islamism may seek for honor or for liberation. Or is there anything obstacle within, for example, thinking on the name of Islamism, for example, to think or to seek for democracy? No, people are not ready to think of the convergence of Islam and democracy. Actually, when the Muslims are seeking for democracy, there is nothing Islamism there. That is the end of Islamism, they said. That is the bankruptcy of Islamism because they don't ask Islam, but they ask democracy. That is very interesting cliche or very interesting prejudgment that a Muslim cannot seek for democracy. Actually, the sociological background of all these revolutions were being shaped by the Muslims, by people who are taking their reference from Islam, but they were also think and ask for democracy, ask for freedom, ask for honor, ask for bread also. So, and the Muslims and the idea or the expectation that Muslim cannot be with democracy is very interesting idea. Now, they are like somebody are like Muslims always with occupied with or is involved with terroristic activities. Actually, they misuse the term of political Islam with militant Islam rather than, and they miss the idea or the element of political within Islamism. Actually, political is not bad things. It is positive element, and they should be prominent in all life. However, in Turkey we had some experience. For example, we had an affair of something being politicized. For example, if Kurdish issue is politicized, that is dangerous. But we defended that no, politicization is not bad. Politicization is good. Politicization is making something very easy to talk to each other, to build a world together, a joint world with all elements of the society. And I think we should continue. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor, and I'm so sorry to cut you short. To try and keep us to time, but the whole day is a problem. But you'll all see on the biography, there's a number of his books listed, one of which is very recent, and I'm sure that would amplify your thoughts. So everyone should look for the opportunity to read your books. Now we have Dr. Maha Azzam. She's a leading policy expert on the Middle East and political Islam, an Associate Fellow of the Middle East and North Africa Programme at Chatham House. She's head of the Egyptian Revolutionary Council and chair of Egyptians for Democracy UK. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. First of all, I'd really like to thank the Cordoba Foundation for putting this meeting together. It's extremely timely, and I really welcome their ability to be able to bring such a broad spectrum of people together. I think it's extremely important that we have this discussion across a broad base of people. Let me start by saying something about the manifestation of what is referred to as political Islam, the recent manifestation, and I think that's very important. We've heard this morning that it's important to define which group we're talking about. But let us assume that we're talking about the broadest, the largest, and the most representative of groups. That is, for example, in the case of Egypt and across the Muslim world, the Muslim Brotherhood. And look at the manifestation of their politics in recent time. I think that there are certain statements that can be made, and again we're open to discussing this in the question period, is that they have remained the major bulwark against violence. That essentially today, in the midst of increasing pressure from authoritarian regimes throughout the Middle East region, particularly Egypt, and the country that I concentrate on and which I am actively engaged with, they have remained the major bulwark against the resort to violence. Secondly, they have engaged fully in the democratic process once it came about after the 2011 revolution. They engaged politically by forming a political party, the Freedom and Justice Party. They engaged in free and fair elections and referendum in which the people of Egypt made their choices freely and chose them above other parties, particularly the FJP. So their engagement in politics and their playing by the rules of the game singled them out, I would argue perhaps, as the most democratic of forces in Egypt. And the same can be said of the engagement of other parties across the region at different times, the Nahda in Tunisia, for example. In terms of the accusations made again against political Islam, that it doesn't evolve, that doesn't keep up with the times, I would argue again that is a misconception, that there is ongoing evolution within the movement of the Muslim Brotherhood, and much of the pressure for that evolution is coming from the youth, to which the elder figures in the Muslim Brotherhood have listened and have made and continue to make very important changes, and we hear this from the youth among the Muslim Brotherhood themselves. That doesn't mean that there aren't more changes that are needed, but the reality of the situation of on the ground has dictated that changes need to be made. So as a force that has strategic vision and is willing to evolve, I think the manifestation today is that they are continuing to attempt to do so. So what I'm trying to get at is that there are major misconceptions that require rigorous academic study, not only political statements which I am making, obviously as part of the Egyptian Revolutionary Council, to which I belong and represent, which has elements of the Muslim Brotherhood in it. But it is telling because, again, through this broad platform that is opposed to the military regime, there are a number of political forces, individuals, and a broad spectrum of political opinion that doesn't just include the Brotherhood. So again, another manifestation of the Brotherhood, which is the broadest and largest representative, if you like, of moderate political Islam, again, is the urge to become more inclusive and engage with others. The issue remains that this is a struggle on the ground in much of the Muslim majority countries, a struggle over rights. In the face of dictatorship, the struggle has been ongoing throughout the 20th century and into the 21st century for some very basic rights. The rights for the right for freedom of speech, the freedom of assembly, the call for accountability and participation. All the aspects of a democratic, of democracy and the democratic process. These rights have not been achieved across much of the Arab world. And the struggle for those rights has been carried through by various Islamist groups and organizations. We're not talking now about those that I believe are outside the spectrum of what is accepted, both in terms ethically, in terms of political rules and regulations, and in terms of religion, those that go outside that realm and resort to extremism and violence. I'm talking about the vast majority of Islamist movements. And those Islamist movements have been the bearers of the struggle for freedom and justice. They have, along with other secular and liberal and leftist forces, worked also for that freedom and justice. So I urge you for a moment to consider these movements and their struggle without the word Islam attached to it. To see the struggle today of those in Egypt fighting the military regime and its security forces and the violations of human rights, not as Islamists, but as people struggling for those rights, that have a vision in which they believe that struggle has components in it, or through which they are inspired to struggle because of their faith or because of the principles of their faith. But ultimately their struggle is universal, and it's a struggle that should be shared well beyond the borders of any region. So I think what we're facing today is essentially a need to understand that there is a vast middle ground in Muslim majority countries and among Muslims worldwide that is saying we need to ensure that those rights should be afforded regarding freedoms, regarding justice, regarding social justice, should be afforded to all peoples the world over. Irrespective of who the bearers of that struggle are, if they are struggling on the basis of principles that emanate from their religion, good and well, there is no problem with that, as long as they don't resort to violence in order to do so against innocents. And that is essentially the framework of most Islamist parties working on the ground today. One of the major strategies, if you like, of the Islamist movement is to ensure that the resistance in the Muslim world remains peaceful. They are also adamant that they become more inclusive. And finally, they are adamant that they reach out to the outside world. They don't want to work in isolation or to be marginalized or marginalize anyone else. But what they seek from the international community and civil society is not only a fair hearing, but they urge them to put pressure on their governments to review their policies regarding their support for dictatorship and ultimately the violence that emanates from such dictatorship in much of the Muslim world. So the struggle again is one over rights and the refusal of the Islamist movement to accept dictatorship that has lasted so long, for decades, in much of the Muslim world. And ultimately, I think we need to see the Islamist movements within the prism of a political struggle for liberation and rights, not in terms of what we are being told by others who oppose any resurgence or change in the political order in much of the Muslim world, that tells us that Islam is dogmatic, that it doesn't want change, that it is ultimately connected somehow to violence. All these are sensational statements that don't accord justice to the vast majority of Muslims struggling for freedom throughout the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed. This is a very rich feast, and there'll be a bit of time for some questions, so I'm sorry to rush things along. Now we have our very own Dr. Azzam Tamimi, who's a British Palestinian academic and political activist, who's written a number of interesting books, including Hamas, A History from Within. Okay, I'm going to remind you though on the time.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله ومن والاه. Again, thanks to Anas, Abdullah and the team for organizing the function. And I was so keen to be here that I flew yesterday from Amman, escaping the sandstorm that was followed by a snowstorm. I was asked to speak about political Islam in Britain. And I've been really thinking about this, Anas. I mean, what can you say about political Islam in Britain? We've heard so much about how confusing this term is, how confusing the concept is. I mean, just let me tell you a very brief story. About 10 years ago, slightly more than 10 years ago, I was approached by Scotland Yard to help them in my capacity as one of the leaders of the Muslim Association of Britain in this country to salvage Finsbury Park Mosque, which I took the offer to my brothers, my colleagues, my brothers and sisters, and we agreed that it was in the best interests of the Muslim community, of Islam, of British society, that Finsbury Park Mosque should be returned to the community rather than remaining in the hands of a bunch of lunatics. And we worked with Scotland Yard all the way. We worked with them on other projects, not because we are lackeys or because we somehow sell ourselves to the enemy, as some people would probably from Al-Muhajirun would like to say, but because we believe this is our country, this is our society. We live here, and we want a safe, secure, free environment for ourselves, for our children, for everybody else. After all, we do appreciate that this is the country to which many of us came because we happen to be persecuted elsewhere. This is a country where, thanks to the values of democracy and human rights, you can find a safe haven and you can express your opinions. Now, unfortunately, afterwards, and the lesson from this story is that you cannot really put in one category Azzam Tamimi, who salvaged Finsbury Park Mosque in collaboration with Scotland Yard, with Abu Hamza and his group in one category. If you put them in one category, then you are as lunatic, as crazy. It just cannot work this way. See, we came to this country as students. Some of us came as political asylum seekers. Most of Muslims in this country came as laborers much earlier and established communities. Now, when I look in the mirror, when I see myself in the mirror, what do I see? Azzam Tamimi is considered to be a member of political Islam, an affiliate of this category of people. What do I see? I see a very simple Muslim being that believes that Islam consists of three main pillars. First, a set of rituals: Salat, Siyam, Zakat, Hajj. Second, a code of ethics. And third, a way of life. A set of principles in the way that I administer my life. Now, this distinguishes someone like me, who is committed to these three pillars, from someone who considers himself to be a Muslim, but doesn't care much about Salat, or doesn't care much about what happens in Palestine, or what happens in Egypt, or probably enjoys a pint of beer or a glass of wine. Yes, you find Muslims of this sort. You find Muslims who are committed to the rituals, but are not so interested in being politically active. So a Muslim who observes the rituals, a Muslim who believes in the doctrine, and a Muslim who cares about the rest of the ummah happens to be Azzam Tamimi, Anas Altikriti, and the affiliates of one strand of this huge category that we refer to as political Islam. So if I really want to talk about something that I know very well, I would, of course we don't have the time, but I would restrict myself to the affiliates of the Muslim Brotherhood school of thought. That's the school of thought I belong to. It's a school of thought that believes that Islam is about living life with others in the best possible way, communicating your ideas peacefully, reforming what is wrong with society, and probably this is what causes a headache to so many people around the world. We were on excellent terms with the British government until we opposed the war in Iraq. Then we become a menace. Because we support the struggle of the Palestinian people, and because we don't consider Hamas to be a terrorist organization, and yes, it is not a terrorist organization, then they don't like us. and you go and conduct a referendum among the Muslims wherever they happen to live. I bet you 99% of Muslims will tell you Hamas is a legitimate liberation movement. That's what it is. Israel, in our view, is the terrorist entity because it took my mother's house and it took my father's land and threw me out of my land. But they don't want to see this fact. We supported the Arab Spring, although we live in this country, but we love to see democracy spread in the Arab region. We supported the Arab Spring in Egypt, in Tunisia, in Libya, in Syria, in Yemen, everywhere, the whole region. And that displeased Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. So they started sending emissaries to Cameron. Cameron, you have to do this, you have to do that. And Cameron is an elected prime minister. They wanted him even to close my TV station, Al-Hiwar TV station. Several times they came to Cameron and asked him to close Al-Hiwar TV station, the Saudis and the Emiratis in particular. And he turns to them and says, it doesn't work here like this. It doesn't work this way in the UK. If you have a case against them, take them to court. So you see, if Israel doesn't like you, if the despotic governments of Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and all the other lousy governments in the Arab world don't like you, then that causes pressure to be built to build on the politicians of this country. And in this way, we become the menace that the Sunday Telegraph talks about occasionally, or some of the other newspapers. But let me assure everyone, let me assure the government as well. We believe in the cause of justice. And we know that like our brothers in Egypt and our sisters in Syria, Egypt, Yemen, and elsewhere, that even if we have to go to prison, even if we are persecuted because of what we believe in, we will not give up what we believe in. And we will continue to struggle, no matter what they call us, no matter what they label us. If this sort of political Islam is causing a problem to someone in this country, then good luck with ISIS and the likes. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed. Is this working? Right now we've got some time for questions. Who would like to start? Gentleman there.
Hello. Khalid Nadeem, South Asia Middle East Forum. How do you deal with the barriers which have arisen between the Muslim Brotherhood and Western governments? There seems to be a problem of communication between particularly the UK and US government with Muslim Brotherhood at the moment. And what is the level of influence being exerted by Egypt and the Gulf states on this relationship between the Muslim Brotherhood and the West? Because this seems to be a big difficulty at the moment, how to go forward, because even when you're not dealing with a party which you're not friendly with, you need to have lines of communication, and the lines of communication seem to be very precarious at the moment.
I think the engagement certainly between the governments of the United States, the European Union, and the Muslim Brotherhood is extremely important. There is no reason to assume that there isn't an ongoing engagement and dialogue. It is the kind of dialogue that the government in Egypt particularly doesn't want to take place. But the Muslim Brotherhood and others that are opposed to, for example, the military regime in Egypt, are constantly reaching out and putting forward explaining the situation in Egypt and exposing the military regime to all governments. It's part of what we do as the Egyptian Revolutionary Council, and it is partly what others from across the Egyptian political spectrum try to do. It's an important engagement, it's an important dialogue, and it will continue. I think the issue here is that there has been pressure, of course, from certain countries in the Gulf, but I think that is changing, and we must not assume that that is necessarily going to be static. After the death of King Abdullah, I think there is a certain attempts to review the stance of Saudi Arabia and others vis-à-vis the regime in Egypt. There may be some opening up. I think that will impact quite seriously on also relations between the United Kingdom and others as regards the regime in Egypt. It won't stop necessarily dealing with the regime in Egypt, but I think there is a growing feeling that the regime in Egypt is a liability, that the general's ability to hold on to power only through excessive force is not necessarily in the best interests of the United Kingdom and the US and others, and that the resort to violence on the part of the Egyptian regime will encourage violence and lack of security, and that will impinge on the interests of the countries like the United States and its allies. So I think the situation is moving fast, and the Muslim Brotherhood, as well as other opposition forces, will continue to put forward their case to Western governments.
Who else would like to come in? I'll take 2 or 3 now. And by the way, my father came from Northern Ireland, from a village just near the border, where there was lots of resistance to the British continuing occupation. Sometimes you have to just stand and keep speaking and resist. And obviously when the bombs were going off in Britain, things got tougher for the broader Irish community. But we ended up with negotiations. So you can do it. Right, yes.
Thank you very much. Councillor Abdul-Mir from Tower Hamlet Council. Just a hypothetical question. If, for example, now the land that ISIS controls now was taken over by, let's say, the Muslim Brotherhood, what would the difference be? And what key priorities would they implement in that particular region if the Muslim Brotherhood took over the areas that ISIS control now?
I'm going to take 2 or 3 so we can get a lot. Who else wanted to come in? Yes, John, and then the guy
In
there.
the Muslim world, Jan, much better.
When I was at school in the 1960s, one of our teachers was Egyptian. He was a Copt, and he was very, very bitter against the Muslim Brotherhood. And I'm talking about the Muslim Brotherhood in the period before Nasser, because his father had felt his whole village, the Copts, had essentially been driven out of it. And they had, now, I know there are always 2 sides to every story, and I know that there is sometimes a tendency to demonize the Muslim Brotherhood on this front, but I would like to hear a bit about where the Muslim Brotherhood stands today and how its thinking is evolving on the question of people of other faiths.
The guy there, with the pale blue.
Thank you. Jonathan Brown. It's a question about the AK Party in Turkey, really. I'd be interested to know, particularly Professor Aktay, it seems to me that the AK Party seems to be becoming increasingly authoritarian, and I suspect there's internal struggles within the party. I'm not interested in hearing that the opposition is really liberal and democratic. I think there's a lot of problems with those statements. But I'm interested in your view on the future of the AK Party's future, and does it remain democratic, or will it become increasingly authoritarian?
Thank you. So we've got 1 question each. Dr. Tamimi, Dr. Azzam, and Professor Aktay. I think the first question was for you. Didn't you address it to Dr. Tamimi?
Well, if the Muslim Brotherhood were to be given an opportunity to rule through democracy, I think the world would be much better. I mean, you saw what happened in Egypt. The Ikhwan did not come through a coup. They did not ride on tanks. They came through the ballot box. And it was the others who didn't like them, including the Copts, who unfortunately united themselves or embroiled themselves with the coup perpetrators out of unjustified fears that led to the current catastrophe in Egypt. And by the way, during Hassan al-Banna, rahmatullah alayhi, the Muslim Brotherhood had Christian members within the movement. And Hassan al-Banna's literature and writings and contacts with the Christians in Egypt are well documented. Of course, later on there were tensions, but these were the product of a political crisis. You see, when the army, when the armed officers take over anywhere in the world, they create political crises. And as a result of these political crises, people start justifying attacks on each other, being unfair to each other, etc. Now, of course, any progress toward a better system of governance will have to come through practice. We have lots of theory, we have very little practice. And what we were hoping in Egypt would happen is that the democratic process would be allowed to take its course for the first 4 years at least. And then if the Brotherhood regime didn't do well, then the Egyptian people had every right to replace them and change them through the ballot box. But that wasn't allowed to happen. But definitely the huge amount of literature we have about Islamic political thought, Islam and democracy, Islam and human rights will have to be put into practice, and there will be trial and error, and then it is up to the people to judge whether we uphold the principles we claim we believe to or not, we believe in or not.
Thank you. Dr. Azzam?
The issue of the Copts is obviously an extremely challenging one when speaking to an audience like yourselves or any others. It's very complicated. And let me say this in terms of the current situation. The position of the Muslim Brotherhood is that the Copts are Egyptian citizens. So the Constitution of 2012 does not differentiate between them. It sees them as citizens. And so the official statements on the public policy is we're talking about Egyptian citizens. And the stance of the Morsi government was one of the complaints of the Copts was that they were not allowed the freedom to build churches. And that was done away with under Dr. Morsi. But the issue is we were dealing with a very short period in which also the church played a role, as did the Azhar, by the way, that was not in the best interests of the majority of society. And we saw this in terms of the coup. The picture of the general, the famous picture post the coup, had the Sheikh of Al-Azhar, and it had the Coptic patriarch as well. So what we're talking about is institutions that should guide their people towards greater harmony and consolidation against the military force and for freedom and so on. I think we have to differentiate between what has been an ongoing level of sectarianism in Egyptian society over many dictatorships. We have examples of killings of Copts under Sadat, under Mubarak, and till now, I believe the military regime, and it's something we need to look out for very, very carefully, that we don't point a finger to the Islamists, because that's what the regime does. The military regime today, in order to survive, has used incitement to violence. I believe it will also use the sectarian card in order to save itself at some point, and will be able to sit back and allow Muslim and Copt to kill each other in Egypt. So regimes in Egypt have constantly played that card. Of course, there are tensions between communities in Upper Egypt that have represented themselves in Coptic Muslim terms. But there are also tensions between Muslim and Copt. So in a sense, the sectarian issue has often been blown out of all proportions by the political order in Egypt. To safeguard against that, you do need to move towards the rule of law and democracy. At least it will be a safeguard in the right direction. Thank you.
Thank you. And Turkey. Current developments in Turkey. I'm sure
Thank you very much. Thank you for that question. Give me opportunity to explain something about Turkey. We probably you now hear many things about the authoritarianism or the ongoing growing authoritarianism in Turkey, and which I think it is really very, very ridiculous thing. Which is I am living in Turkey, and we know everybody who are paying any attention to Turkish close history should of course realize that what really radical change from the older situation to existing situation has happened. And of course that story, which is an authoritarian regime of Turkey, is a very interesting story, which has too much customers. That is I think the interesting thing, that has much ready prepared customers in the Western world, because it gives the chance to destroy the story, the only one Muslim success story in the world, which has combined democratization and probably Islamic values, not to say of Islamic State or Islamic State, but Islamic values and democracy in the world now. You can see in Turkey really in 12 years of AK Party period government, you can see a sort of silent revolution in terms of democratization, in terms of the increasing of expression of freedom of expression. And also you can see, for example, those who think about authoritarianism, I think that there is very strong movements in Turkey that which is called Gulen movement, which is very, very strong in media, which is very, very strong even within Turkey. They have many TV stations, they have many newspapers which are publishing and broadcasting within Turkey, and they are all the day they are talking about authoritarianism within an authoritarian state. That is a paradox, and that is even an irony actually. And how you can see, how you can talk about authoritarian state within authoritarian state? Can you talk about authoritarian state in Egypt? Can you talk about an authoritarian state in any authoritarian state? Can you talk about the authoritarian nature of any authoritarian state within that state? I think that is really ridiculous, because in Turkey we have now about 1,500 TV stations and about hundreds of newspapers. At least among these 70% of all these are belonging to the opposition. And from all the day they are broadcasting against the government, against the existing government, against Tayyip Erdogan. They are saying he's dictator, they are saying he's this and this, and they are criticizing in all ways. But nobody is prosecuted because his criticism. And there is another story, I think, which is really very black propaganda, which is made by these new groups on the other, in addition to other groups, of course. They are saying, for example, and what is surprising for us, disappointing from our point of view, especially the Freedom House report, which reported that there is many journalists arrested in Turkey, and we asked about the names of these journalists. Who are these journalists? Really, we are living in Turkey, and we didn't hear any journalist was arrested because he had made any journalistic activity. There is nobody. There is any journalist who is arrested because of his journalistic activities. Somebody who are supposed to be arrested are arrested because they are murderers, for example. They are smugglers. They are, for example, involved in some terrorist activities, and nobody asks about whether they are journalists or not when they are committed these crimes. If you are committing murder, nobody asks you whether you are a journalist. If you are a journalist, you will be privileged, or you will be, of course, positively discriminated. Nobody asks this. Of course, this is very ridiculous. And especially the groups, the Gulen groups especially, I think, and unfortunately, is very, very successful in making this propaganda. And because they are very strong in media, and still their strength in the media is ongoing. And somebody from them, some journalist, one journalist only, arrested not because his journalistic activity, not because any idea he declared, not because his any article he wrote, not because any his declaration he made, but because he made a conspiracy, fabricated some evidences against some other journalist groups, and he caused them to be arrested for 3 years. About at least 10 journalists were arrested because of their fabrication of the evidences, and actually they were the only reason for making some pressure over the other journalists, and they are very, very intolerant in Turkey, and you cannot criticize Fethullah Gülen from their point of view, of course. I mean, in the time when they were relatively more legitimate in Turkey, nobody could criticize Fethullah Gülen. And now I am being tried because I criticized Fethullah Gülen. And hundreds of people are now in cases of the courts being prosecuted because they criticized in this or another way Fethullah Gülen. But nobody is being prosecuted because he criticized Tayyip Erdogan now. But Tayyip Erdogan, the image of Tayyip Erdogan, who is the only, I think, successful story in the world, in the Muslim world, is trying to be destroyed, is trying to be deconstructed, And if a Muslim and democracy story, successful Muslim and democracy, the only Muslim democracy story tried to be destroyed. Thank you.
Thank you. We could feel the strength of feeling. We've got time for a couple more questions. We've got to finish at 5 past so you can get your tea break, so we can keep the woman here and the guy right at the back.
Thank you. My name is Muna Al-Qazzaz. I am a member of the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood and a former spokeswoman for the office in London. Professor Aktay and Dr. Tamimi mentioned that grouping all the Islamic or political Islamic movements in one sack or one bag has a lot of repercussions. I was wondering maybe if Dr. Maha Azzam can tell us what does she think on a societal level and on the individual level, what are the repercussions? So what are the repercussions here in the UK for different organizations functioning, and what could be the repercussions even on the individuals?
This guy right at the back. And there was a woman in the middle, if you could squeeze it in, if you'd all be brief.
Thank you very much. So my name is Mariam. I'm from the Muslim Association of Britain, and my question is to Dr. Maha. This is in regards to the youth advocating for political changes within the Muslim Brotherhood. But how is that development for women who want opportunities to participate in politics and be more involved in the higher order of the Muslim Brotherhood? Thank you very much.
Thank you. And the guy at the back. And then if the answers can be relatively brief, we can keep on time.
My name is Yasin Yaman. I'm a consultant social worker working for London Borough of Hackney. And my question is for the Right Honourable Clare Short. If she could answer, I know she's the moderator. I just wanted to basically kind of ask a question about democracy. As everyone basically kind of maybe many people in this room would know, kind of there is a significant remark from Hassan al-Banna in relation to what democracy is. And he says democracy is like kind of an idol. And if it is basically in favor of...
Sorry, we can't hear you.
Is like an idol.
Is what?
Idol. Yeah.
Idol. Democracy is like an idol?
That's right. And if it is in favor of basically kind of Western kind of rulers, then fine. But if it is not in their favor, then it's a horrible thing. Now in Turkey, democracy is being kind of basically injected to kind of Middle East and other countries. And we had kind of AK Party kind of winning elections basically kind of one after the other with kind of a huge majority. But during the kind of uprising of Gezi protests, we heard from basically Western rulers, Obama, that democracy is not all about elections. Same went for the
Be brief, please.
Yeah, same went for basically kind of Egypt. And my question is basically, when is West gonna basically commit to democracy? Because they have kind of, Middle East has tested their commitment to democracy, and they have failed and failed. And I think the review of Muslim Brotherhood as to whether they are a terrorist organization or not is in itself basically as a disgrace, because Muslim Brotherhood, Morsi didn't kill anyone, but Sisi basically has murdered many people, and it's not him who is being reviewed, but it's Muslim Brotherhood. And that's a disgrace in itself.
That was a nice little speech. briefly for platform, yeah. Well, just say whatever you want to say, just to wind up. We've only got a few.
Now, regarding the first question, I know you addressed the question to Maha, but if I may say so, I think it would be much better if people addressed singular organizations, the positive and the negative that is to do with that organization. I know that at the moment the government is worried about ISIS, but it's also worried about the Muslim Brotherhood. So rather than talk about broad terms, political Islam, tell us what is your problem with the Muslim Brotherhood, and then we can then try and resolve these issues. But if you have a problem with ISIS, then good luck in whatever you are trying to do, although in my opinion it's just a waste of resources bombing ISIS from the upper heavens. But it doesn't matter, that's for them to decide. But with regard to mainstream organizations in this country, there should be transparency. The government should be speaking to us, should question us. we should have a constructive dialogue, because we are here, we are involved, and we are also authoritative. And they have to understand this. We have influence within the Muslim community, and most of the Muslim community agrees with our point of views on various issues.
Thank you very much. Let me add to your question. I think the danger of seeing all Islamist groups as one and all prone to violence is going to lead to more violence. We were told over decades in academic sources, particularly in the 70s and 80s, that we must look at the variety of Islam. The emphasis was on variety. What we're seeing now is a complete reversal of this attempt to look at the various expressions of political Islam and the different expressions of it in the Muslim world. And there is a clear political motivation behind this, in order to undermine any expression of political Islam that can lead to change of particular regimes in the Muslim world. And we need to differentiate between them, because it will create greater frustration among the young. I'm not saying all the young. There is a commitment, as I say again, for the vast, vast majority of the Islamist movement and Muslims not to resort to violence, and they will not resort to violence. But we're talking about the kind of arguments that you would be giving and support to those extremists that will say they're lumping you all together. There is only one way to deal and with those that are suppressing us, and that is the resort to force. There needs to be differentiation. You need to listen, I think, very clearly to what the movements and the participants in these movements are saying. So governments, at the very least, should be able to differentiate between both in order to open the middle ground for those that have participated in democracy, will participate in democracy once there is the opportunity to do so. And that is what the struggle in Egypt is all about. We want the military regime to fall. We're going to work for it, to bring it down, in order to have a civil and democratic society in which all can participate, including the Freedom and Justice Party and all parties, Islamist, non-Islamist, leftist, socialists. That is what we wanted after the January 25th revolution. That's what the Arab Spring is about. And that is what the second wave of revolution is going to be about as well. But we want to limit the radicalization and the arguments of those saying that violence is the only way. And governments in the West need to help us in this by not putting all the Islamists in one basket. Just very briefly on the women. Yeah. On the issue of women, yes, the reality is women are there on the ground at a grassroots level. They're there participating in the demonstrations every day in Egypt, in the protests, and in Tunisia, and so on. What we're talking about is institutionalizing that participation. And I believe there have been changes within all movements, and the strategies for change need to be, yes, institutionalized, and I believe that will come with time, because often people say that once the revolution or the change is achieved, women go back to their homes. I believe this time something very different is happening on the ground, across the board, from both men and women, and women's role will only increase and not diminish. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Professor Aktay.
Thank you very much. I would like to go back to my first question, or for title, first title about the open society and its enemies in the Muslim, the democratic society and its enemies in the Muslim world. And I mentioned about the possible enemy is supposed to be the Islamist or the political Islam, but of course my answer is not this. After that we witnessed during these 3 or 4 years in the Muslim world after the Arab Spring, that became very obvious, that very, very, very clear that the supposed the enemies of the democracy in the Muslim world are not the Muslims or the Muslim Brotherhood, the demonized Muslim Brotherhood or the demonized political Islamists. They came in democratic way, they came in power, and they were very, very well prepared and very ready and accepted to go by elections if needed. And but somebody made a coup d'etat against them, and those who made the coup d'etat were in this or another way, somehow welcomed by the Western world, which are seeking for democracy in the Muslim world. And that is really very, very interesting thing that we should be focusing on. And this is the paradox of the Muslim world also. And the enemies of the democracy in the Muslim world. And the Muslim, just to remind, thank you for Ergin when he reminded me about the Gezi movement. The Gezi movement was simultaneously it took place in the same time of Tamarrut movement in Egypt, when the Tamarrut, I mean in Tahrir Square, people were gathered against Mohammed Morsi because of accusing him to be very authoritarian. And what came after this accusing or criticism of authoritarianism? It came a coup d'etat, and now we have Sisi. And I think the same thing after the Gezi movement was motivated on the base of the criticism of Tayyip Erdogan or AK Party movement, because it is an authoritarian regime, is an authoritarian party, even though we have elections. And now after this Gezi movement, we passed through 2 elections, one local elections and the other presidential elections. And now we are in the eve of the next election, in the parliamentary election. If anybody have any criticism, any objection to the existing government, he can, for example, send Tayyip Erdogan or his team, and he can bring any other who is supposed not to be authoritarian. I mean, the regime is open, democracy is working in Turkey, and there is no danger of authoritarianism, but still, the discourse of authoritarianism is being employed by somebody, and this, I think, we should take lesson from the history, from that very close the history which we are living in, and this is to create and to try to get the same results, the same consequence result which was taken in Egypt. Thank you.
Well, could we, and the answer to the young men at the back, because we're really out of time, is exploring the nature and manifestation of political Islam today. All our panelists say it's a quest for democracy, for freedom of speech, for the rule of law, for everyone to be respected and have dignity. The West has versions of it, imperfect, but everybody needs freedom of speech, dignity, the chance to have their voice heard. And all over the world, we should quest for that. That's my answer to you. Can we please thank our panel very warmly for starting us off so well?